January 17, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The dawn breaks cold over the Atlas Mountains, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain where scattered acacia trees stand like silent witnesses to what is about to unfold. The air smells of dust and diesel, mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder still lingering from yesterday's artillery exchanges. German Panzergrenadiers of the 21st Panzer Division crouch behind their positions, eyes scanning the horizon through the pre-dawn haze. They have heard the rumors. The Americans are coming. Green troops, fresh from a homeland that has never known invasion, never felt the boot of conquest on its soil. The veterans of Stalingrad and the Eastern Front exchange knowing glances. They have faced the T-34s of the Red Army, the stubborn British Matildas at El Alamein. What could these newcomers possibly bring that would change the calculus of this war? Then they see them. Small, boxy vehicles bouncing across the rough terrain like mechanical insects, moving in loose formations that seem almost careless to the rigid tactical minds of the Wehrmacht. The German soldiers squint through their field glasses, and some actually laugh, a low, guttural sound of disbelief. These are not proper military vehicles. They look like toys, like the motorized playthings rich American children might drive through their suburban neighborhoods. No armor to speak of, open tops exposing the crews to any passing bullet or shrapnel fragment. Thin canvas stretched over flimsy frames. The Germans have their Kuba-wagons, yes, but those are scout vehicles, meant for reconnaissance, not serious combat operations. These American contraptions seem even more fragile, even less substantial. One well-aimed machine gun burst, one grenade, and surely these tin boxes would crumple like paper. But what the Germans do not yet understand, what they cannot comprehend from their positions in those North African hills, is that they are witnessing something that will haunt them for the remainder of the war. They are seeing the Willys MB, the vehicle the Americans simply call the Jeep, and with it comes a logistical philosophy so alien to the German way of war that it will take years of bitter defeat for them to fully grasp its implications. The story of the Jeep begins not on battlefields, but in the frantic desperation of 1940, when France fell in 6 weeks and Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. The American military, watching Europe burn from across the Atlantic, recognized a crisis in its own ranks. The U.S. Army possessed fewer than 500,000 men and equipment dating largely from the previous war. There was no dedicated light reconnaissance vehicle, no standardized transport for infantry on the move. Officers rode in requisitioned civilian sedans. Troops moved on foot or in trucks too large for tactical flexibility. The Army needed something new, something that could be everywhere at once, something that could redefine mobility itself. In July 1940, the War Department issued a specification so demanding it seemed almost impossible. A four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying a crew of 3+ equipment, able to traverse any terrain, and, most critically, producible in enormous quantities at high speed. Only 49 days were given for the first prototype. American Bantam Car Company, a tiny firm on the edge of bankruptcy, took the challenge. They delivered the prototype in 75 days. It weighed 1,840 pounds, over the limit, but it worked. Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company soon joined the competition, refining the design, strengthening the frame, boosting the engine. What emerged was a vehicle that weighed 1/4 ton, stood just over 5 feet tall, stretched 11 feet long, and could go anywhere. Its 4-cylinder engine produced only 60 horsepower, but the Jeep's brilliance lay not in raw power, but in its versatility. It could ford streams, climb 40-degree slopes, and travel at speeds up to 65 miles per hour on paved roads, though pavement would be a rare luxury in the years ahead. By 1941, Willys and Ford had standardized production. The assembly lines began to hum. Within 3 years, American factories would produce more than 640,000 Jeeps, an average of one vehicle every 2 minutes around the clock. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their industrial philosophy favored specialization, specific vehicles for specific tasks, each engineered to exacting standards. The Kuba-wagen served as a light transport, built by Volkswagen under Ferdinand Porsche's supervision, and it performed admirably in its limited role. But Germany produced only 50,000 Kuba-wagens throughout the entire war. The rest of their transport needs fell to a chaotic mixture of requisitioned civilian vehicles, captured enemy equipment, and horse-drawn wagons, yes, horses, hundreds of thousands of them, plodding along muddy roads while the Wehrmacht claimed to be a modern mechanized force. The German army entered the war with 625,000 horses and would rely on them until the very end. Even their panzer divisions, those supposed elite armored formations, depended on horse-drawn supply trains trailing miles behind the tanks. At Kasserine Pass, the Americans suffer their first major defeat in the European theater. Rommel's Afrika Korps, despite being at the end of a supply line stretching back to Europe, despite fuel shortages and dwindling ammunition, mauls the inexperienced U.S. forces. The Jeeps that the Germans mocked prove unable to stop panzers, unable to withstand the disciplined fire of veteran troops who have learned their craft in the crucible of the Eastern Front. German after-action reports note the Americans' confusion, their poor coordination, their tendency to abandon equipment when pressed. One German officer writes in his diary, "They have much equipment, but little understanding of how to use it. Their little vehicles race about like confused ants. Give us 6 more divisions, and we will drive them into the sea." But this same officer notes something else, almost as an afterthought. He describes how American supply trucks arrived at the front lines within hours of the battle's conclusion, how American engineers, riding in their toy vehicles, appeared seemingly from nowhere to establish casualty collection points, how American artillery, towed by jeeps, repositioned with a speed that German units, dependent on slow-moving half-tracks or horses, could not match. The officer dismisses these observations as irrelevant. After all, Germany has won the tactical battle. The Americans are retreating. What does it matter how quickly they can move supplies or reposition guns when they lack the will to fight? What this officer does not see is that the Americans are learning. Every jeep lost at Kasserine teaches a lesson. Every breakdown, every ambush, every tactical failure becomes data fed into a vast learning system that spans the Atlantic. In American depots in England, in planning rooms at the Pentagon, the reports are analyzed, the doctrines are revised, and the jeeps keep coming, pouring off assembly lines at a rate the Germans cannot begin to match. By the time the Allies invade Sicily in July 1943, the jeep has evolved from a curiosity to a necessity. The island's mountainous terrain, its narrow, winding roads built for donkey carts, should favor the defender. But American commanders have learned to use their mobility as a weapon. Jeeps carrying infantry platoons race ahead of the main columns, seizing crossroads before German forces can establish defensive positions. Jeep-mounted 50-caliber machine guns provide mobile fire support, appearing on a flank, delivering devastating bursts, then vanishing before German artillery can respond. Radio-equipped jeeps carry forward observers who can call in naval gunfire or airstrikes, turning the offshore fleet and the aircraft overhead into extensions of ground commanders' will. German soldiers defending Sicily write letters home describing an enemy who seems to be everywhere at once. They speak of the unsettling experience of holding a position they believe secure, only to discover that American forces have somehow materialized in their rear areas, cutting supply lines, establishing roadblocks. The jeep's ability to traverse terrain considered impassable for vehicles becomes a psychological weapon. German troops can no longer trust the map, can no longer assume that a steep hillside or a rocky stream bed will protect their flanks. Wherever the Germans look, it seems, there is another of those small American vehicles, and with it comes death in the form of machine gun fire, artillery strikes, or air attacks. The invasion of Italy transforms the Jeep from a tactical asset to a strategic enabler. The Italian peninsula is a defender's paradise, mountain ranges running like walls across the landscape, rivers that swell with autumn rains, roads that turn to mud under the tracks of heavy vehicles. The Germans, withdrawing northward in their fighting retreat, believe they can bog down the Allied advance, turn Italy into a bleeding ulcer that will drain Anglo-American resources. They establish defensive lines with names that will become synonymous with sacrifice: the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line. They demolish bridges, mine roads, and fortify every town and monastery. And for a time, their strategy works. The Allied advance slows to a crawl, measured in yards won at appalling cost. But the Jeep changes the equation. While American Sherman tanks and British Churchills bog down on the main roads, Jeeps find alternate routes. They follow mule trails into the mountains, ford streams that have no bridges, navigate forest tracks that don't appear on any map. American engineers, using Jeeps to carry tools and equipment, construct temporary bridges overnight, turning impassable rivers into minor obstacles by dawn. Medical evacuation Jeeps, modified with litter racks that can carry multiple wounded, retrieve casualties from forward positions in minutes rather than hours, dramatically reducing mortality rates. An American soldier in Italy has a survival rate of over 95% if he reaches an aid station alive, a statistic unthinkable in previous wars and made possible in large part by the speed of Jeep-based evacuation.
German commanders begin to include the Jeep in their tactical calculations. Wehrmacht planning documents from late 1943 contain specific instructions for dealing with American mobility. Units are ordered to establish ambush positions not just along main roads, but along trails and secondary routes where Jeeps might pass. Minefields are laid in greater depth, covering areas previously considered too rough for vehicles. The Germans are adapting, but they're adapting reactively, always one step behind, because they lack the industrial capacity to match American mobility. For every Kuba-wagon the Germans field, the Americans deploy 20 Jeeps. The mathematics of attrition favors the nation that can replace losses faster than they occur. June 6, 1944, Normandy. In the pre-dawn darkness, as paratroopers fall through flak-filled skies and landing craft plow through rough seas toward Omaha and Utah beaches, Jeeps come ashore in the first waves. Waterproofed, sealed against the salt water, equipped with snorkels that allow their engines to breathe even when submerged, they drive directly from landing craft into chest-deep water and up onto the beaches. Some sink when their waterproofing fails, others explode when they hit mines, but more keep coming, an endless stream of them, and by nightfall on D-Day, despite the carnage and chaos, despite the German resistance and the murderous fire sweeping the beaches, American forces have put thousands of Jeeps ashore. The Germans defending the Atlantic Wall expect the invasion, but they expect it to follow certain patterns. The Allies will land, establish a beachhead, spend days or weeks building up supplies before attempting a breakout. This is how military operations work. This is how the Germans themselves would do it. Amphibious invasions are ponderous affairs, limited by the capacity of ports to receive ships and unload cargo. The Allies have no port. Cherbourg remains in German hands, defended by forces that will hold out for weeks. The nearest functioning harbor is back across the Channel in England. But the Americans don't wait for ports. They bring their own harbors, the Mulberry Docks, those artificial harbors towed across the Channel in pieces and assembled off the invasion beaches. And they build roads, not slowly, not methodically, but with shocking speed.
American engineers, using jeeps to carry surveying equipment and tools, lay down wire mesh roadways across the Norman fields. They construct Bailey bridges over streams and shell craters. Within days, a logistics network appears where none existed, and along every route, jeeps move in endless convoys carrying ammunition, medical supplies, rations, mail, spare parts, fuel. German soldiers captured in Normandy speak in their interrogations of the unnerving abundance of American logistics. They describe positions bombarded continuously because American artillery never seems to short of shells. They tell of attacks pressed home again and again because American infantry always has ammunition, always has reinforcements. One captured officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the Omaha Beach assault, shakes his head in disbelief when interrogators ask about American supply lines. There are no lines. The supplies simply appear. The little vehicles, they bring everything. In Russia, we learned to identify Soviet units by their supply vehicles. But the Americans? The Americans use the same vehicle for everything. You cannot tell what is coming. It might be ammunition, it might be mail, it might be soldiers, it might be a general. They are like ants, and the ants are winning. This is the revelation, the terrible understanding that begins to seep into the German military consciousness in the summer of 1944. The war is not being lost on the battlefield alone. It is being lost in the rear areas, in the invisible realm of logistics where boring, unglamorous vehicles carry boring, unglamorous supplies. The Germans have been fighting a 20th century war with 19th century logistics, depending on railroads that Allied bombers destroy, on horses that starve when fodder runs short, on captured French trucks that break down for lack of spare parts. The Americans have built a logistics system so robust, so flexible, that it can function even when parts of it are destroyed. Lose a supply dump to German artillery? The jeeps simply route around it, establishing new distribution points. Lose a bridge to German demolitions? The engineers arrive in jeeps within hours to construct a replacement. The symbol becomes the substance. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field becomes a fortress and every lane becomes a killing ground, American forces learn to mount additional weapons on their jeeps. The .50 caliber machine gun becomes standard, bolted to a pedestal mount, where it can transverse a full 360 degrees. Some units add 30 caliber machine guns as well, turning a single jeep into a mobile weapons platform, carrying more firepower than a German infantry squad. Enterprising mechanics weld armor plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles onto the sides and front of jeeps, creating improvised gun trucks that can support infantry assaults. The commanders don't order these modifications. They emerge organically from the troops themselves, soldiers adapting their tools to the demands of combat. The Germans have no equivalent to capacity for this kind of bottom-up innovation. Their military culture emphasizes obedience, discipline, adherence to doctrine. Modifications to vehicles require approval through chains of command, paperwork filed in triplicate, official authorization. By the time permission comes, if it comes, the tactical situation has changed. The Americans simply do, and because they have so many jeeps, they can afford to experiment. If a modification fails, scrap it and try something else. If it succeeds, share the idea and let other units adapt it to their needs.
August 1944. The breakout from Normandy. Operation Cobra shatters the German defensive lines, and suddenly the war becomes fluid again. A war of movement where speed matters more than firepower. American armored columns race across France, and leading every column, scouting every route, are the jeeps. They advance 50, 60, 70 miles in a single day, speeds that seem impossible in military operations. German forces attempt to establish blocking positions, but before they can dig in, before they can lay mines and string wire, the jeeps arrive, identify the positions, call in airstrikes or artillery, and the way is clear for the tanks and infantry following behind. The German army in France collapses not from lack of courage, but from lack of mobility. Units receive orders to withdraw to new defensive lines, but they move on foot or in horse-drawn wagons, and the Americans arrive before them. Supply dumps are overrun before their contents can be evacuated. Headquarters units flee, abandoning their radios and maps and cipher machines, all the apparatus of command, because they lack the vehicles to carry them. By the time the remnants of the German army retreat across the Seine, they have lost not just men and equipment, but cohesion itself. They are no longer an army, but a mob, and the distinction matters. The Jeep becomes a symbol that appears in unexpected places. In liberated French towns, American soldiers arriving in their Jeeps are greeted as saviors. Children chase the vehicles through the streets, laughing and calling out for chocolate and chewing gum. Women weep and kiss the soldiers, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation from occupation to freedom. For the French, for the Belgians, for the Dutch, the sight of those small, ungainly American vehicles means the nightmare is ending. The Germans brought tanks and artillery and the machinery of oppression. The Americans bring jeeps, and with them a promise that life can be different, that a future exists beyond the gray tyranny of Nazi rule. German soldiers retreating through these same towns see the celebrations and feel the bitter sting of reversal. They remember their own arrival 4 years earlier, remember the sullen faces of conquered populations, the fear in the eyes of civilians who knew better than to resist. Now they are the ones fleeing, and the civilians they once terrorized line the streets to cheer their departure. The Jeep, that vehicle they dismissed as a toy, has become the instrument of their humiliation. Autumn 1944. The German border. The Allied advance stalls as supply lines stretch to their breaking point. American armies have raced across France so quickly that their logistics system, robust as it is, cannot keep pace. Fuel runs short, ammunition dwindles. The jeeps that carried the army across France find themselves rationed on gasoline, their drivers ordered to conserve every gallon. This is the moment when perhaps the German dismissal of American logistics might prove justified. The Reich's propagandists seize on the Allied pause, proclaiming that the invasion has culminated, that Germany's defenses will hold, that new wonder weapons will turn the tide. But the pause is temporary. In the rear areas, thousands of jeeps operate what soldiers call the Red Ball Express, a dedicated convoy route where vehicles run day and night carrying supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. The drivers, many of them African-American soldiers in a still segregated army, push their vehicles to the limit and beyond. They drive through the night without headlights to avoid German aircraft. They navigate roads cratered by bombs and shells. They coax dying engines forward for just a few more miles, just enough to reach the next depot, and the supplies flow. Not fast enough, never fast enough, but enough to keep the armies fed and fueled. The Germans, watching from their fortified positions along the border, struggle to comprehend what they are witnessing. Where is the culminating point, the moment when the attacker exhausts himself and the defender can counterattack? Where is the opportunity that German doctrine promises will come when an enemy overextends? The opportunity never arrives because the Americans refuse to fit into German doctrinal frameworks. They create new paradigms, new ways of sustaining military operations that have no precedent in European military history. December 1944. The Ardennes. The Germans launch their final gamble, massing their remaining armor for a desperate thrust through the Ardennes forest. It is a plan born of delusion, a belief that one dramatic victory can somehow split the Allied coalition and force a negotiated peace. For a few days it seems to work. German forces punch through American lines, capture fuel dumps, surround entire divisions.
The weather turns foul, grounding Allied aircraft, neutralizing American air superiority. This is the moment, the Germans believe, when their superior tactical skill will prevail. But even encirclement, even cut off from main supply routes, American forces continue to function. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division holds out against overwhelming German forces, and they hold not just through courage, but through logistics. When the siege begins, jeeps are already racing along every possible route, carrying ammunition and medical supplies into the town. When roads are cut, the supplies come by air, paradropped into the shrinking perimeter. And when the weather clears and the siege lifts, when Patton's Third Army arrives from the south, the lead elements racing up the road to Bastogne are, inevitably, jeeps, scouting ahead, confirming the route is clear, guiding the relief columns forward. The Battle of the Bulge ends as a catastrophic defeat for Germany. They commit their last reserves, their newest tanks, their final stocks of fuel, and they achieve nothing. The Allies bend but do not break, and when they counterattack, it is with a logistical superiority so total that German resistance simply dissolves. By January 1945, the Allied lines are restored and pressing east, and the German forces that launched the offensive are shattered beyond repair.
Captured German officers, interrogated after the battle, speak with a resignation that borders on despair. One panzer commander, asked why the offensive failed, laughs, a harsh, bitter sound. "We destroyed their tanks," he says. "We overran their positions. We did everything our doctrine said would bring victory. But the little vehicles, your jeeps, they kept coming. We would destroy 10 of them, and 20 more would appear. We would cut a road, and they would find another road. We would prepare to attack a position we believed isolated, and we would discover they had been resupplied in the night. You did not defeat us with your tanks. You defeated us with your logistics." Spring 1945, Germany. The Reich is dying, crushed between Soviet armies advancing from the east and Anglo-American forces driving from the west. Cities burn, refugees clog the roads. The machinery of Nazi government grinds to a halt as communications collapse and commanders lose contact with their units. In this apocalypse, the German soldiers fighting their last battles see the jeep everywhere, ubiquitous and inescapable. They see jeeps carrying American officers to accept the surrender of entire Wehrmacht divisions. They see jeeps leading columns of American armor into Berlin's outskirts. They see jeeps carrying military government officials who will administer occupied territories. They see jeeps pulling trailers loaded with food for displaced persons camps, with medicine for overwhelmed hospitals, with gasoline for civilian generators. The vehicle they mocked in Tunisia, the toy they dismissed in Normandy, has conquered their nation. Not through firepower. The jeep carries no cannon, mounts no significant armor, but through mobility, through versatility, through the philosophy of abundance it represents. The jeep is the physical manifestation of American industrial power, the four-wheeled symbol of a nation that can produce not just weapons, but a vast, complex logistic system to sustain those weapons in combat across an ocean and a continent. In the rubble of German cities, children approach American jeeps with hands outstretched, begging for food. American soldiers, many of them barely older than the children themselves, reach into their rations and share what they have. The Germans who watch these exchanges understand that they are witnessing something their own ideology cannot explain. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. But here are American soldiers who crossed an ocean to fight a war, who endured hardship and danger, and who now, in victory, show mercy to the children of their enemies. The jeep, in these moments, becomes more than a military vehicle. It becomes a symbol of a different way of organizing society, a different relationship between government and citizen, a different understanding of what power means.
When the war ends in Europe in May 1945, the U.S. Army possesses hundreds of thousands of jeeps scattered across the continent. Some are battered and worn, held together by improvised repairs and the skill of mechanics who have kept them running through thousands of miles of combat. Others are nearly new, just arrived from American factories that continued producing even after victory was assured. The question arises, what to do with them? Military planners debate shipping them home, but the cost of transport is prohibitive. They consider selling them to Allied nations, but the British and French have their own surplus vehicles. In the end, many jeeps are simply given away or sold for nominal sums to local governments, farmers, businesses. And so the jeep remains in Europe, transformed from weapon of war to tool of peace. In France, farmers use jeeps to plow fields and transport crops. In Italy, they become taxis and delivery vehicles. In Germany, they help clear rubble and rebuild shattered cities. The German soldiers who return home from prisoner of war camps, who try to resume lives interrupted by years of war, see the jeeps in their streets and understand the lesson. America won not because Americans were better soldiers, though many were brave and skilled. America won because it possessed a system that could produce and distribute the tools of war faster than those tools could be destroyed. The jeep is the proof, the evidence rolling through their towns on 4 worn tires, carrying bread to bakeries and mail to post offices. The vehicle they dismissed as a toy has outlasted the 1,000-year Reich.
In the decades after the war, military historians and strategists analyzed the Allied victory, searching for lessons and insights. They studied the great battles, Normandy, the Bulge, the drive to Berlin. They examined the decisions of commanders, the performance of weapon systems, the evolution of tactics. And buried in countless after-action reports and logistics studies, they find repeated references to the jeep. Not dramatic references, not tributes to heroism, but simple notations of miles driven, tons carried, hours of service. One study calculates that American jeeps in Europe logged more than 600 million miles during the war. Another estimates that the average jeep in frontline service was destroyed, damaged, or worn out after about 15,000 miles. Yet even this was acceptable because replacement vehicles arrived faster than losses accumulated. A third study notes that the jeep's greatest contribution was not tactical, but operational. It changed the tempo of warfare, allowing armies to move and fight at speeds previous generations would have considered impossible. But perhaps the most telling assessment comes not from American sources, but from a post-war interview with Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected commanders. Asked what weapon he most feared during the war, von Rundstedt surprises his interrogators. He does not mention the Soviet T-34 tank, nor the American strategic bomber, nor the British Royal Navy. Instead, he says, the American jeep. With it, your soldiers could be anywhere. With it, your commanders could see everything. With it, you made the battlefield transparent in a way we never could. We had better tanks, often better guns, sometimes better men, but you had better logistics, and in modern war, logistics is everything. The jeep did not win World War II. Men won the war. Men who fought and bled and died in places whose names most of them could not pronounce before they arrived there. But the jeep enabled those men to fight. It carried them to battle, supplied them under fire, evacuated them when wounded, and gave them a mobility that transformed the nature of combat. In doing so, it became something more than a vehicle. It became an idea made metal and rubber. The idea that abundance could defeat scarcity, that flexibility could overcome rigidity, that a democracy's industrial strength could outlast a dictatorship's tactical brilliance. The Germans saw the jeep as a toy because they misunderstood what they were seeing. They looked at individual vehicle and saw something flimsy and vulnerable.
They failed to see the system behind that vehicle, the factories that could produce it by the thousands, the supply chains that could deliver it across oceans, the mechanics who could repair it in the field, the soldiers who could adapt it to any purpose. They failed to see that the Jeep was not meant to be individually powerful. It was meant to be numerous, to be everywhere, to be the connective tissue binding an entire military machine into a functioning whole. Mile by mile, Jeep by Jeep, the Americans conquered Europe, not just territory, but the logic of warfare itself. They proved that wars are won not by the army with the best soldiers, but by the nation with the strongest economy. They demonstrated that mobility is power, that speed is armor, that being able to do something adequately everywhere is better than being able to do something perfectly somewhere. These are lessons the Germans learned too late, paid for in cities turned to ash and a generation lost to war. Today, Jeeps, descendants of those World War II vehicles, still roam the roads of Europe and America and every continent. Some are lovingly restored by collectors who understand their history. Others serve in armies around the world, modern versions of a design that proved its worth 80 years ago. But the real legacy of the Jeep is not mechanical, it is conceptual. It changed how armies think about mobility, about logistics, about the relationship between front lines and rear areas. It proved that the unglamorous work of supply and transport can matter as much as the glamorous work of combat. And somewhere in all this, buried beneath the statistics and the historical analyses, is a simpler truth. The Germans saw the Jeep as a toy because they could not imagine an army that possessed so many toys it could afford to break them. They could not conceive of a nation so wealthy, so productive, that it could ship hundreds of thousands of small vehicles across an ocean simply to make its soldiers slightly more mobile. They failed to see that the abundance itself was a weapon, perhaps the ultimate weapon, against which courage and skill and tactical brilliance could not long prevail. The Jeep conquered Europe mile by mile, not through strength, but through presence. It was there when needed, always, everywhere, carrying everything an army requires to function. And in the end, that was enough.